go on record and say I unabashedly love this movie.
I'm
asked
pretty
to
much in the same
talk with us about it.
I mean, when you put it out there, I did pick it, and I loved it to the degree that I was shocked when I started hearing people. Because I don't know if this is universal, but at least in my circle, I've heard people talk shit.
Right.
And say it's like a Hallmark card and say,
it's a gooey movie.
The performances are bad.
Sure. Yeah.
And I was shocked because I felt like I had witnessed, I will say
we haven't introduced
a classic.
Oh, Chris Gethard's our guest today.
Hey, how you doing, everybody? Buy my new book, Lose Well.
Ben just wrote on a piece of paper, introduce Chris.
Cool. It's Blank Check, Power Scissor Cast, Big Fish, Chris Gethard. We got it all out of the way.
People know who.
Time check, 45 minutes?
Yeah.
It's about 40 minutes. Yeah.
I loved it. I loved this movie, and I thought I was shocked that people didn't.
When this movie came out,
did you see it in theaters?
I did, and I have actually. I have a story that I don't know if it's amazing to the outside, but for me, the circumstances by which I saw this movie, I will never forget. I will never forget.
I want to hear that.
Well, okay, so
shit.
I've always been like a very big Jersey guy. If you know my work at all, you've heard me ramble about New Jersey.
Yeah.
And I lived there for the first 23 years of my life. And it was a place that I really loved. It was a place where I felt very safe. And it was a big piece of my identity. When I started doing comedy in New York, I was 19. And I kind of became known as like, oh, that's that kid who takes the train in from Jersey. And he's so much younger than the other people. And I think people liked watching me figure it out. And then I would get back on the train and go back to Rutgers. And I was this kid from Jersey. When I was 23, I got hired for my first ever job in Los Angeles. Really my first, outside of doing like some spot acting gigs, like, you know, dressing up for some of those Conan bits.
was this for Crossballs?
Crossballs.
Yeah.
So I got this job on a Thursday and was told that I had to be there on Monday. I'd never set foot in California in my life. I think I'd never been further west than Chicago. And all of a sudden it was like, you have to move out of your house, where I still lived with two of my college roommates. You have to quit your job. You just have to go.
Right.
And the job I was working at the time, I worked at a magazine called Weird New Jersey.
Right,
I'd worked there for 3 or 4 years. And if you, most people would not know that magazine, but I will tell you, anybody who grew up in New Jersey who's around my age or younger will say, it's an institution. It's an institution. And if you think about sort of the ethos of Weird New Jersey, it is sort of local legends and myth making with a pretty clear policy of who cares if it's true, if it's a fun story.
Sure.
And a lot of these stories are rooted in some shred of fact and then grow out of control. So I fly out to California. I quit my job there. My boss was like, oh my, he later was like, you can always give 2 weeks. They pressured you into not, just give 2 weeks. If they're not going to give you that, you should be wary of working with them. I was like, you're right. But I didn't know that. I was young. It felt like my shot. So I moved out to California. This was before there was a UCB theater there. There wasn't much of a comedy scene. The comedy scene that there was well beyond my experience point to participate in it.
It was like big shots only. Really.
Yeah, big. I wasn't going to go up on stage at Largo at the age of 23. And I was shy. I was scared. I was depressed. I'd been on medication for a year. This was in the early 2000s. I had all these side effects. All of a sudden, my mom was terrified that I was going that far away when I was in that state. And I had a friend who I knew, I think 2 or 3 people. I knew 3 people who lived in California at the time. And one of them told me, why don't you come stay with me at first? And he lived, I believe, if I remember right, it was Huntington Beach. And he told me that was part of LA. And it is a very, very far. I believe it was about a 2-hour drive.
But I would be you, or I'd be like, Huntington Beach, sure. That's nearby,
I've heard of
right?
it.
Yeah.
And I think it was Huntington. I'm not sure. Whichever beach it was one of those beaches, you know the name. And my buddy shows up, lets me into his house, and he's like, hey, I got to go. And he doesn't even hang out with me.
Sure.
And I'm terrified and I'm overwhelmed. I walk on the boardwalk. I eat a fish taco for the first time in my life.
One of the loneliest and most overwhelming cities to be in, especially if you don't know anything about it.
Southern California is an isolating, and you feel it immediately.
Incredibly isolating.
Yeah.
And like the idea of going out for a walk, the city's just kind of like, you can't really do that. Like kind of laughing at you.
Yeah. I got one quick question for you.
Yeah.
The fish taco you ate, what was the size of that thing?
It was pretty small. I was shocked that
it wasn't a big fish taco.
No, it was not a big fish taco. It was a small fish taco. I like that you thought that was the moral story where I was going.
I didn't think that was the end of the story, but I thought that might be a little fun
pretty
bump
big.
in the
He said
journey.
fish. He said fish.
No, but that first night, the first night I spent away from home in like a, and I mean home in a big sense.
I get it.
Yeah.
Like my Samwise moment of I've never stepped this far away from my home. Like that's a very impactful scene.
Your
Fellowship.
Mount Doom was
A little bit.
seeing Big Fish in
Well,
Los
I
Angeles?
went to a movie theater,
Sure.
bought a ticket for the next movie that was playing. It was Big Fish. And here I am watching a movie that's about stories that don't necessarily need to be true. And why don't you just buy in? They're fun. It was my whole life that I had just walked away from kind of summed up. And then also about this character that's like, no, you got to kind of go out and build your own legend. And you have to go into places that don't make sense for you. And you have to go into environments that aren't the small place you come from. And that doesn't mean you can't show pride in being from a small place or a beat up place. All these things that the movie wears on its sleeve. I sat there in that theater and I was so scared, but I just cried so hard. And it gave me a lot of, it felt like a weight had been taken off my shoulder of like, okay, I made the right choice. You got to take some big swings and you got to kind of go on your own hero's journey, and you got to love stories.